Okay, so we're here to talk about the history of SRI and packet radio and the transmission of 1977 between three networks. So shall we just get a little background on each of you? Jim, do you want to start?
Sure. I started when I was in graduate school at SRI in 1976, I guess the fall or summer of 76, and joined the packet radio program at the time, and was working on the operating system and working on the software that was put into the terminal interface unit for that.
And what was your degree in?
My degree was in control systems in the engineering department, and but my experience was mostly in software development throughout those years. So it wasn't a computer science degree, it was control systems. But and later left SRI to pursue that after being there for a couple of years.
Don?
I'm Don Cohn, and I was involved with the packet radio program right from the very beginning. My primary function was to provide technical support to the program. I designed the van, my technicians built it. I installed the packet radio network in the Bay Area and managed to keep it running for quite a few years. And I also participated in, I think all of the demos that were done at SRI, both in Don's group and also in Mike Frankel's.
And what was your background before getting involved in that?
I went to work at SRI in 1954 as an explosive technician. And my history is rather jaded. I've had a lot of lives, many of them at SRI, but eventually a research engineer in the engineering division.
So you were in that role when
Yes.
the packet
Yes.
radio project started?
Right.
I'm Don Alves, and I was a hardware technician working on packet radio from under Don Cohn for all of the time I guess we had packet radios. I joined SRI in 1959. At that time SRI was expanding and a lot of different projects, and Don Cohn was interviewing graduates from junior colleges. After 4 years at the Coast Guard, spent a couple of years at junior college, got a degree in associate degree in electronics, and hired in the next day after graduation into the communication and physics and say it was the old lab. It was a combination radio physics and communication
And
lab.
telecommunications.
Yeah, telecommunications. And so all the time Don was responsible for putting this van together. And we had built some FCC vans just prior, and the shapes and all really limited the whole configuration of equipment and everything else. So Don came up with the idea that we want a square van instead of a Dodge that we had used previously with all the curved surfaces. Made it very difficult to mount things on, and also it wasn't going to be possible to run a lot of the equipment that we were going to be running in there without elaborate mounting systems. You noticed the racks in the van had hydraulic pans on them that we pumped up and dampened out all the vibrations. So it made it possible to operate hard drives and things on a moving van. Normally a mobile unit would just take something somewhere and set up and start running, but here we would crank up at SRI and take off operational around the whole Bay Area. And it was interesting, we did enough of these runs that we knew everywhere where we would have a failure, and it was pretty predictable. We could be a block from SRI and lose signal at that frequency range. 1.8 or something doesn't go through trees at all. And it would pick it up right back up, and we would know all the spots after a while up in the foothills and wherever it was possible to sort of script things so we knew where the drop-offs were, and you could see the continuation, whether we were 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops, through several repeaters back to the site. So that was very interesting.
I'm Don Nielson, and I also joined SRI in 1959. And I guess I came in fairly early to the packet radio program. ARPA had actually started a similar project in another part of SRI, and it wasn't going very well because there was no knowledge there about the radio discipline at all. So it was transferred into our area, and I'm not quite sure, but I think I was the first project leader. I was certainly the project leader on it for a while until I became lab director, and then Ron Kunselman took over the project leadership of it. So all I know is I had a really lot of talented guys to do all the work that needed to be done, and I was trying to make sure we had program continuity and that kind of stuff. Plus, I also participated a lot, maybe the principal one, in trying to characterize the radio channel as to what we were facing at those frequency ranges, both from a noise and a multipath point of view. So when Vint tells his story about the police in San Francisco approaching the van and trying to say what's going on in here while I was parked measuring noise, it was just me in the van, that's all. And he likes to embellish it and say it was full of generals and all that kind of stuff, but it was, at any rate, so I was out in it by myself as well as many times when other people there. We had a really, I think, fairly sophisticated measurement system based on an interdata computer and a lot of A to D sampling and all that helped us tell Collins what kind of a radio they should build, given the fact they were going to do spread spectrum at this particular frequency. And another gentleman who should be here, his name is Stan Freilich. He was really a good radio and systems engineer, and he contributed also quite a bit to the Collins insight as to what was needed. So mainly I was just a project leader, interface to ARPA, and ran some of the packet radio working group meetings over time. That's enough.
And the packet radio started with 72 then?
It started around 72, 73. It's a little debatable as to what the beginning was. It was at SRI a little before then, but when it came to be called packet radio and we knew that Collins and these other collaborators were joining us, it was probably early 73 is my guess.
And had you worked with Collins before?
No, not appreciably, and this was new for us. No, we had worked with BBN in earlier incarnations of the ARPANET, but not Collins.
And that was with different set of people at SRI,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So when did the idea this van was built specifically for the packet radio project?
Van was built as a piece of capital equipment, and I think we wanted we thought more generally about it than just packet radio, but packet radio soon took claim on it, I think, as the most often used project, and it became essentially a packet radio van. But I think in the beginning it was a capital equipment that was supposed to serve the various purposes of the laboratory that a mobile data collection facility could use.
So it was Don Cohn who, it fell to you to really design the...
Yes, the laboratory in general had a need for mobile measurement capability.
For what other things besides?
We were involved in a variety of radio propagation programs. We had done work for the FCC. As Don commented, we put together a couple of mobile units for them. And with the potential of packet radio and a source of revenue to support it, we started planning that van. We pretty much knew what we needed to do. We had a computer that we had to get in there, and we knew that we had to be able to drive around with that computer running And I put a lot of energy in, and also applied the approach that we had used in the Federal Communications equipment to isolate that computer from the world, and it worked. It worked well. And we had issues about noise reduction in the van because we wanted to measure radio noise, and put a lot of effort into isolating the electrical generator from the rest of the world. And basically, the concept worked quite well. We debugged it a little bit from time to time. But it was a good mobile laboratory and gave us an opportunity to do a lot of things besides the demos. As Don said, it was used for making channel measurements that was really its initial purpose. Driving military folks around in the van wasn't in the original plan, but it worked out. There were enough handles in the ceiling that none of them fell down.
Didn't lose the general, the whole thing.
Not a single,
didn't
maybe a
lose it.
couple of lower ranking ones. Because you told me there were up to 12 people in that van.
He said it holds 17.
We had a
Well,
in the report.
there were 17 people in it, but they were good friends.
Yes, if not before.
I think that was a result of one of the packet radio
Working group.
packet,
You really
group
packet
meetings.
them in, huh?
And well, everybody wanted to see it, and
And also TCP working group came by from time to time, so it was probably those groups, not the generals. I don't think you would.
no,
No.
we didn't try that with generals.
It was the TCP working group meeting that visited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when would that roughly have been?
That was, it said in our report, it was in October '77.
Yeah.
So that was after the September demo.
And the van was in really ready to go by what date? I mean, a couple of years before that.
I think we completed that van in probably mid-76.
Oh, I
Oh,
thought.
I thought it was earlier than that.
Maybe it was a little earlier than that.
But you bought it.
What was the year of the van? What model? Do you remember?
Don knows. I don't.
I don't. I thought it was
I think it's a 74.
I thought it was like 74, so
Yeah.
I thought we had a little earlier than
Well,
76.
we may have.
But it took
Slipped
you a
my
while.
memory.
How long did it take? I mean, you spent a while converting it, obviously.
Well, it went fairly quickly. I don't think it took us more than perhaps 8 or 10 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Oh, okay.
It's relatively simple. It's not a hard thing to do. We had a plan. We knew what needed to happen, and we had good shops at SRI who could make the furniture and make the custom hardware to support the racks, and the technicians were able to pretty much do the interiors on their own. So it went quickly.
And do you know how much it cost, the van?
I don't even want to think about that.
You asked me that the other day, and I bet you the whole thing is less than $15,000.
I think probably it would have been less than 15,000.
With all of it, but of course the custom work is hard to.
Well, it's hard, I suppose
Well,
it's hard to
don't
track
figure.
the labor for
It
that.
all went on some bills,
Yeah.
but we just don't know what those are. That's not counting any equipment in it, of course.
And,
Just
so
the-
when you took it out for tests and demos, you went quite a distance. So this was a real outing. I mean, where did you typically go? How far?
Well, initially, the first order of business, of course, was to distribute packet radio repeaters in the Bay Area. Without the repeaters, the van was useless. And we did that we did some site research, located places where we could install them, made arrangements with various entities to use their towers. And we spotted the receivers, one on Mission Ridge. We, of course, had one at SRI. We had one at SRI's field site up behind Stanford University. And we had one up, is that Berkeley?
Above the
Grizzly,
Caldecott
yeah.
Tunnel.
Grizzly Creek.
Right above the
Grizzly Creek.
Caldecott Tunnel.
We also had
And
one
San Bruno.
on San Bruno.
San Bruno.
And yes, And also eventually we had one at Xerox Park.
Do you have, are any of the repeaters in existence?
Those are just simply mostly packet radios. In fact,
Okay.
those things are just packet radios, and the only packet radios I know that exist are in the van.
By the way, the Collins Radio asked, what's his name, Stevens, does anyone know of any more of those packet radios? Because Collins destroyed all of theirs.
I asked Collins, I've checked, the most logical places for them to be were at Collins or SRI, or maybe I found one at Fort Monmouth. But generally they weren't under anybody else's purview, so that's the only place to look,
Those are
really.
probably the only ones.
There were some logistic issues associated with that network that Mike Sisko reminded me of this morning. He said that I had called him in a panic because we were having so much difficulty. These sites were remote. Some of them were difficult to get to. And periodically, packet radios, like all computers, would flip their lids and have to be rebooted. And rebooting consisted of pushing a red button. And that got old very, very fast. So Mike said that I had called him and said, you know, I can't handle this. We've got to do something. And he that day dismantled one of the Collins lab telephones and created from the keypad a remote button pusher for me, which we installed on all of the remote repeaters and resolved the issue. And I don't recall having to call and push that button very often.
But as I also mentioned last night, I think there was a question, software was always changing.
Right.
And we didn't hear that much from the Collins folks, unfortunately, because their software people weren't here. But that whole evolution, you know, I would say the hardware was fairly, the RF section was fairly stable compared to what was going on underneath in the digital section. And so it was, I mean, every week or so, or it seemed like there was changes to this so-called CAP software, Channel Access Protocol software. Because that was totally evolutionary as to how we would handle the movement of data in this kind of ratty network. And so that meant that we could eventually make those changes, either debugging changes or reloading parts of the software or whatever remotely from SRI, and I think eventually cross-net, you know, internet. That was a huge benefit too, so we didn't have to keep climbing Mission Ridge over there in the slippery winter time and whatever.
And was that early in the project or not?
Fairly early, I think. Well, certainly the ability to do it on an intranet basis was fairly early. Crossnet was something. The one thing that had to be developed is that there was a protocol called, it was CAP, Channel Access Protocol, which the repeaters used to move packets through. There's also something called the Station to PR, called SPP. And that originally didn't have any really good flow control or sequencing in it. And so at some point we took some of the guts of TCP and put it in SPP so that when the station talked to the innards of a PR, for example, you knew that you had a reliable link. That was sort of essential, or else you're going to load most but not all of what you wanted to load.
Yeah, I mean, before that, what was implemented was a simple send the packet and wait for an acknowledgement. If acknowledgement came back for the sequence number that you'd sent it for, then you went on. If it didn't, then you'd retransmit.
That's right.
And it was just a single, no window opening like TCP where you could say send 5 or 6 packets and wait for an ACK. It was just one at a time. But we did develop a little later something like TCP, and it's documented in our quarterlies about DSP, the dispatching program, which allowed us to make connections from the station, measurements software or program. It had a process running in there, and it was like TCP, but it was just DSP, and it did have a windowing where you could transmit, and have a few packets queued up before you had an acknowledgement. So it was kind of similar to TCP, but just for the local area network, just from the station software.
What was the division of labor between what the software that was done at Collins and what was done at SRI?
Well, the Collins did the packet radio, the IMP16 software. At SRI, we had station software, the operating system, and we had the terminal interface unit operating system, which was done by SRI with Dave Ritz and his team. And then BBN did portions, modules that went into the station software, like the gateway and like the measurement process software. Julie Sussman did that.
Yeah, I think it's useful to make a distinction between who is recommending changes and who maintained the software.
Sure.
Collins maintained the software and the PRU. BBN maintained most of the station, although that wasn't entirely true. But
Yeah.
most of the station was maintained by BBN, and most of, if not all of the software in the TIU was maintained by SRI.
Yeah.
Okay. But you were, as the kind of, well, you were the integrator, right?
Yeah.
So it was SRI that was making some of those decisions. As to,
As I said last night, you don't want to be at the end of the line. You know, you have to make all this stuff work. And while it was a wonderfully collaborative, well, most of the time it was wonderfully collaborative, it was arduous at times just because we had to try to make things work and they weren't working, either because they weren't designed well or because the reliability wasn't what it should have been, either software or hardware. So, but it would have been okay if it was just a prototype project, but these lousy demonstrations would come and all of a sudden things had to work. And I would say that was a fairly tough mental environment, you know, to work in, to make sure that when they called up and said, George Heilmeyer's coming for a demonstration, well, you know, it wasn't easy, you know, to make sure that it was going to go okay, because who wants to watch a failed demo?
and paint a picture for me, if you will, of one of these demos in the van. Once the packet radio was operational to some extent, so you would take people. What was your standard thing to show people, or was there?
Anything else you want to start on then, let Don fill in?
Well, if they like, I just refreshed my memory what was described in terms of the software, what they were seeing. But there was like 4 different things that would be started up for them. There was the one display that you described before, where you have the generation, the character generation that was just going across the screen.
Interrupt.
And that was an end-to-end. It was 2 telnet sessions all in the same unit, going out and then coming back, and you saw that pattern generation. But there was other things being displayed on 2 or 3 other displays, things like the measurement data, the statistics that were being displayed. You could see what packet drops were occurring, what delays were occurring from the terminal unit to the station, and those kind of statistics, which were later summarized after demonstration. So I'm sure the pattern generation was the most visible, and what was typically shown. Okay, here we've stopped, and we don't have a connection right now, and you can see the pause in the display. But there were certainly other processes going on at the same time.
We also had a rather infamous text file that I cannot tell you how many times that thing ran and repeated. And I believe that Ron Kunselman probably originated that, but there was a long text file called Super Programmer. And that worked well for the military types because it was real words, not just a text, a text pattern. And it would run for probably 10 minutes.
It was a large file that they had at ISI. They would transfer to.
It's a huge file, and you could just keep dumping it. And that was used a lot in the van. And it really got people's attention. They sit there and never a character would be missed. And that was the religious experience for many of the military types. They were accustomed to radio communications that were less than reliable, particularly in mobile environments. And to see that made a big impression.
And they would see it as just It's being
just the
transmitted.
text would
it
just
interrupts and then it comes
it would
back.
interrupt and
Same
come
thing.
right back, and never an error. And I commented earlier to Don about making what I thought at the time was a faux pas, but eventually became part of the demo. One of the younger military types who was a techie asked me, and this was a small group, I think there were only 4 people in the van, what happens if there's a hardware failure? And I said, well, it's, you replace a module. And I pulled the frequency synthesizer out of the radio. And of course the text stopped. And I said, I would just reach in the drawer and pull out another one and plug it in, which I did. And of course the text started, and never a character was missed. And we sort of used that from that point on. That.
But would you pretend it was spontaneous?
Robustness.
Oh, I mean,
Well, seriously, the first time when I got it out, I thought, what in the hell have you done?
Was it designed to be hot swappable?
They were. The packet radio was all CMOS, and it was hot swappable. It was not. I wasn't afraid of that. But I thought it's pretty dumb when you've got a demo that's really running here and you break it on purpose. But it worked out.
so that was in the course of how long? What was your typical tour? How long would it take?
Don, why don't you speak to that? You drove the truck more than I.
Well, I think we had a couple different loops. We looked at our time schedule and saw how it was going, and we had a half-hour loop or an hour and a half one. Sometimes we'd go up in the foothills, and we knew places where we could stop and talk about it and still have continuous signal, either through the Stanford repeater or one of the other ones. And so
what
we would
what were
know
some typical loops?
about what to expect.
Typical loop. He wants to know a typical loop. Can you remember?
Well,
With large crowds, they were typically at about 30 to 35 minutes.
But where would you go?
we'd go out from SRI, go up Ravenswood, go down Middlefield a little ways, up to where?
We'd go down to the Bay Shore,
Go down
Used
the
to
Bayshore,
up and
go
down Bayshore
south,
Freeway.
down
Yeah.
the freeway to San Antonio.
Sometimes out on the
come
salt,
back on El Camino.
sometimes on the Baylands, and sometimes we went up into foothills, but that's always more problematic.
Yeah.
And there is a picture on that stuff that was circling last night. I don't know, here's a picture of it going down 280.
Which was brand new at the time.
Yeah, so you go up on 280 and down, and it would be dropouts, but generally it was okay.
And Rosati's, how did it? That was just a fun place.
That was something we didn't typically go to Rosati's. We had done the first really gateway, I think solid gateway transmission, and so back on the question of the SE&TD System Engineer and Technical Director role, which was SRI's privilege, I think, to be doing. Sometimes it didn't seem like a privilege, but anyway, part of that was the whole demonstration schedule. Most of it, of course, was bringing things together and making them work at arbitrary times specified by ARPA. Here comes this crew, would you watch over them? But a lot of the SE&TD had to do with not only trying to make things work, but find out why they didn't work. So there was a lot of measurements and a lot of testing of the software and the repeaters and everything that got fed back to BBN and to Collins. I'm sure there were suggestions that came in from UCLA as well that we had to filter into the system and feedback to make them implementable in some way. But the SE&TD, the one that seemed most visible, even to this day, are the demonstrations that we ran, and those were, by and large, successful. I guess if you look back over the 20 or 30 of them that we did, there were very few that really would be considered failures. I think the magic of these guys made that possible, and
They were
sometimes
decreed to be zero defect demos.
and sometimes you had to retreat to an earlier version or something to make sure that it worked, because these things were always getting updated. So anyway, that was essentially the nut of the. Plus, answering Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf when, things may not be going well or whatever, or need for more money, or those things were all part of it too.
And how often did they come around?
Vint and Bob? Not terribly often. They come for some of the demos was the main thing because of George Heilmeier, the director of ARPA, came. Of course, Bob or Vint had to be there, or both. Or they very often came when there was a special party to impress, and then they would essentially take over that interface for SRI. Whereas if they weren't there, then we dealt directly with whoever the visiting authority was. But very often they would carry the ball in that respect. And they were fortunately savvy enough and familiar enough with what was going on that they could help us and essentially get through testy moments and things like that. So.
And Rosati's?
Oh, so finished Rosati's. There was a time when we had first tested the Gateway software. That was the spring of 1976 when the Jenny came out actually, and we got the Gateway installed, and we started doing testing in May and June or whatever. And there came a time when we had to issue the weekly report. Normally that was done on the ARPANET and fanned out to the various people that participated. But we had the notion of a little celebration because most of this is just kind of cut and dried and you just keep going. And so we went out to Rosati's on, probably it was a Friday, because I think Friday was the day that the packet radio reports were due, and let's have a little celebration, the fact that now we can go across the network easily or without error. And so we had this large accumulated file out there. I don't remember if it was on tape or whatever, but Nikki Giannakopoulos, the secretary with us, he was integrating this stuff, and the paper was rolling out the back of the Silent 700 and down onto the ground. And it was just a little day of celebration, which turns out my own personal assessment would be that that's probably the first good, solid demonstration of a two-network TCP. And it was enough of accomplishment, I guess, that we chose to celebrate it. Not that we knew what it would anticipate in any sense of the word. We got through another hurdle at ARPA. Here's another thing I should mention. We had a series of things called local area demonstrations that worked out with Bob initially and then Vint. And these were progressive measures or thresholds of accomplishment. First you get repeater talking to repeater, and then you'll get repeater talking to station, then you get forwarding through the repeaters to the station or whatever, the station management of these. And I think LAD7 was the gateway one. And so you worked away, eventually you got up to 23. I'm not sure we ever got to 23, but the list was 23 long. Increasingly capable demonstrations called LADs, and we reported on those as part of the progress. That was also part of the SE and TD role.
And these weekly reports?
Weekly reports.
Who wrote those?
People who were working on it mainly. They were assembled by the project leader with contributions by Jim or Don or whoever, and say, you piece it together and maybe there'd be a page or page and a half or whatever, or maybe more if there was demonstration. And those got sandwiched together and put out on the ARPANET, or in this case, Rosati's over the packet radio network. I dearly wish we had those. That would be, talk about a historical document. They don't exist, to my knowledge.
Well, they're printed on thermal paper, which, disintegrates.
Right. But there were also normal Xerox copies of them around for a while, but anyway.
So no one's dug
they're
up
gone.
any of those. Okay. It's not the first time this has been asked.
Right. I mean, this wasn't important. Why would we say them?
Well, we had non-technical activity reports that would go into that too. I mean, like our trip, Jim Mathis and I went to Boston for one of the meetings and stuff, and we'd send back by mail the activities, and Mugged in Boston was the title of one of ours.
Sure. And then there was other things SRI did, and I think it's a good way. Do you remember Hellbat? Were you there?
I don't.
You weren't in Hellbat, but Jim Mathis, and did you go to Oklahoma?
No.
Anyway,
But
there was
meetings in these
there was a
places.
military artillery capability called TACFire, and it was how on earth the military was to report back from the forward observers and aim the guns and shoot the guns. And this was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And so somebody wanted us to go put packet radios and overlay to this normal voice communication network that the artillery was using on TACFire. So we put packet radios out there, and we had terminals and repeaters and all that stuff. And the amazing thing is that we had a shelter. This was in a military shelter. And pretty soon, people were coming to watch what was going on in that shelter, because we had on the scope, you could see all the connectivity and the messages flowing and everything. And that was where the eventual generals come to watch, because you can't watch this thing. It's spread over acres and acres. And so here they come in the shelter and watch that. That was one of the telling moments when you knew that this had the capability of doing more than just communicating. It was a display, essentially, of the current situation. That was an important demonstration.
What year was that?
I want to say it was 78 or 79, something like that.
And so what was it like working with UCLA?
With UCLA? I'll take a shot at that. UCLA's, we viewed them as theorists, which they were. I mean, Lynn Clark was there, and he wrote some things even specifically about packet radio that were fundamental, and how many repeaters could you have and whatever. And Fuad, one of the things we had to work out in the radio world was what was the multiple access strategy for this radio. We know it was a contention channel, so how on earth do you do this? We know that aloha, which meant transmit anytime, simple aloha, and transmit anytime you want was a loser. I mean, you got to about 18% of channel capacity and it would die, or the delays would go infinite. Slot aloha was another. And finally, this whole world of CMA arose and is a part of the solution. And part of that, I think, came from Bob Kahn, this notion of spread spectrum, and we got into that in the Collins thing a bit. But then there was this whole question of, how do I know when to transmit? And so from Fuad and others, Fuad, you got this notion, well, let's listen. Let's be at least intelligent enough to listen to see whether or not there's somebody on the air before we transmit. Because we know if somebody's on the air, we're just going to collide. And so this whole question of carrier sense came up, and Fuad told me last night that he named it, and I thought that's wonderful. I mean, it's truly, even to this day, a sort of cornerstone as to how one makes the first order correct decision to transmit. It isn't perfect, because there's people that can hear you that you can't hear them, but nevertheless, it was those things. The other thing, to my recollection, and correct me, Fuad, if this is wrong, but was the whole modeling aspect. Can you model this radio system in a way that would intelligently guide us into the design of it? Well, my assessment, personal opinion, is that was almost a harder problem than putting the stuff together in order to make it work. I mean, it's a terribly difficult thing. Any time, and these guys would do it from first principles. This wasn't any screwball thing that would work only for this or whatever. They approached it rigorously, and any network to model that is dynamic as this one was is really a difficult thing. So I kind of felt that it was hard sometimes to use the UCLA networking prediction, the modeling things, just because the pace of things being driven not necessarily by us, but by Bob and Vint, was just more than. Is that fair assessment?
Yes. Very complex system
Yes.
to model or to understand the behavior thereof. And as being the network measurement center, we were responsible for finding out the right ways to assess the performance of such a system, even if we only had a small test bed and we had to do some simulation. One thing, in a sense, a little correction on what you have done,
Yeah.
said, Don, about carrier sensing and all that. In all fairness, the original idea came, I will say that, and in a moment. The original idea came from a technician at the University of Hawaii by the name of Dave Wax, who worked on the Aloha system.
Remember the name.
And was mentioned by Norm Abramson at one of the meetings at Rockwell International. And coming back on the plane, Len and I, we started looking at what the protocols could be and how we would analyze it. But there was input from many people. That's what was very interesting about this project, is that everybody was contributing, and eventually, yes, it's possible it's one person runs a little faster with some idea to do like work and performance evaluations as I have done. But
Thank you.
And so what do you want to sort of add to the SR? Well, let's talk a little bit about the event that brought us all here. So by late 77, you were, whether you knew it or not at the time, moving toward the 3-network test. But SRI had a clear sense of that. Some of the other players really didn't see it as something to work toward, as a sort of concrete day-to-day goal. But this was more for, how did you perceive it, this idea of hooking up to the SatNet and ARPANET? Was this a big deal, or was it a sideshow?
No, I don't think it was either. We had gotten fairly used to the packet radio ARPANET
Right.
combination. That was almost second nature in all the demonstrations that preceded this one. And I don't think there was a demonstration we conducted all during that summer, at least, that didn't involve the ARPANET as well as the packet radio network. But so here comes this other one, and most of us at SRI, I think, were fairly oblivious to the satellite network. It was out there.
That's true.
We knew BBN and Linkabit and others were working on it, but it didn't affect us at all.
But, Bob last night made the comment that they were viable entities. They existed. We just weren't that aware of it.
No, that's what I'm saying. But from our point of view, that didn't exist. So when the requirement came to do the rest of this, then it was essentially blind faith on our part that part of the system would work. And our job, of course, was to make the TIUs in our work that we were speaking the right TCP at that particular point, and was there a host on the other end that was speaking the same TCP, but what happened at BBN and University College London and those places was really off our radar screen. And
So did you know many of the people involved?
we knew
You knew Dick.
the London people. We certainly knew Paul Spilling and Norba, because he'd spent some time at SRI. But
Right.
University College London we didn't know very well. But the BBN folks,
They did.
we did. Jenny Strazazar was also the one that built the gateway for us, and Ray Tomlinson was deeply involved in the early days of design of software for the packet radio. And so a lot of the people we knew, but not all of them.
But not, okay. So on the 22nd then of November, tell me what that meant to you at the time, if anything.
Another day at the office.
Honestly, I don't think if I had not found it in the reports I had saved, I don't think we would have been able to marshal a reconstruction of it. It was that routine in the sense of doing things. Sure, there's a new network involved, but we weren't, as I said, we weren't principally involved in that. That was just another link in the chain. And so my guess is that at the end of that day, we were all ready for the next day or 2 days later or whatever for the next demo. I think in that one report you can see there's a sequence through October and November of just seemingly unending demos. So we were focused on, it's just like a football game. You won today, but we got another game tomorrow.
Another day, another demo.
Yeah, I think before we close, I'd like to get a little bit more enrichment of the TIU, and I have to say some things about Jim Mathis, and since Jim McClurg worked on that a lot, could you kind of talk about the innards of the TIU?
The TIU. Yeah, well, well, Jim Mathis, of course, was the major contributor for that portion of the software to demonstrate TCP. And as Don mentioned, we've got to make sure it's the same version that the other locations were running. And at the time, we had UCLA had come up on TCP and BBN.
ISI and BBN.
And ISI, yeah. And so that was a major component, was for demonstrating that portion. But the TIU had some things that weren't visible that were important. It was kind of a first version running a micro operating system, which was a stripped down version of ELF. ELF was, I forget what Dave Retz made that, what that stood for, extensible something or other. I'm not sure what it stood for, but it was a precursor to Unix operating system, but all done in assembly language. And so that was underneath kind of the driving platform to run the TIUs and the station network node, the same node. But it also had a telnet, the same thing that you would find on the timeshare, the PDP 10X system. So telnet was running on there. So where were we at? The TIU and the major components, telnet was one of them, which was, the TIU basically was a host computer, but a miniature computer that connected to the packet radio. And telnet was the major application just for communication. You could set up multiple sessions. It was multi-processing. And it supported multiple processes, so we could do the measurement processes in parallel to the demonstration telnet sessions, in parallel to doing the printout of statistics and things that were occurring. And very small. I think we started out with 4K of memory, maybe. Core memory, fortunately, so it wouldn't go away. But we had parallel efforts going on. Jim doing the TCP. I was doing some measurement software and also a stripped down version of TCP put into the TIUs just to provide local area communication, much like you would have NCP on the ARPANET. We had our own packet radio protocol. It was using SPP, as it called, the sequence processing, which was a single recoverable transmission of packets. But on top of that, you could actually set up some sessions between other nodes within the packet radio. So the parallel effort of all those folks being able to put stuff in, all the development was done on the timeshare systems and remotely loaded into the units over most of the time just from the ARPANET. We'd connect the terminals on the ARPANET, download into the TIU or the station software remotely, and had a remote debugger which would give you commands for stopping and starting, and it was very, very handy. And of course, that's a similar thing that they did with the IMP16, I guess, for uploading there. They could remotely do that. I wasn't familiar with that as much, but it was pretty advanced, I would say, at the time for software development environments to be able to do all of that on the timeshare systems and not have to actually sit at the LSIs. I mean, the LSI 11 has a couple of switches and that's it. So there's not much to do on the device itself. And
I want to mention a little bit about Jim Mathis. He would be here, except about a month ago, not quite, he went through an 8-hour brain operation, the second of his life, and he really was an important part of the success of the 22 November demonstration, because there were 3 sites, I'm sure you know by now, that had contracts to develop TCP. One was Stanford, one was BBN, and one was University College London. And Jim was entrenched in that at Stanford, along with other people, and another gentleman by the name of Darrell Rubin, who they both came to SRI sometime. My recollection is that it was early 76 or maybe late 75, but Jim came with some emerging version of TCP. And so the question was, if and he went to work on the Packet Radio project. So how do we implement this in that world? And there was the LSI 11 or whatever, and so Jim actually wrote some of the effective operating systems for it, so you could shoehorn this stuff into there. And to my recollection, he finished TCP there. I don't know that there may have been some BBN to Stanford exercise of it before then, but this is one of the first really working, and certainly was the first one that worked in a cross-net basis, packet radio network, as opposed to an intranet ARPA use of TCP. And so Jim was the person most responsible for making that work, and he's I think a brilliant guy, and he really made it go. And at that time there was lots of feedback on what was wrong with TCP. I mean, and I don't care if it was windowing or forget this, forget that, or whatever. There was delays, timeouts, all those kind of things through all these networks had to be tuned, if not redone. And so Jim was right at the forefront of that, and my guess is that we wouldn't have done that November demonstration if Jim hadn't have been there and did all that he did. I just want to mention that in his absence.
Well, I like to paint a picture, it's a memorable picture, flying back from a TCP working group meeting in Boston. Vince Cerf was on, Jim Mathis and I, we were flying back, but one of the images, I was not involved with the working group meeting that in terms of design of TCP that much, but I was curious as to what's the big deal. And I have this image of the rabbit with a watch from Alice in Wonderland, Vince Cerf running up and down the aisle in the airplane, all worried about this or that technical detail, and he's talking about time delay. He says it's all about time, How long do we wait for acknowledgement, or do we wait 1 second or 2 seconds before timeout? We've got to go over the SATNet. And it was just that image struck in my mind. Is the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland worrying about the time.
There were things like three-way handshakes, and I can't remember when they come in, but there were things that made TCP solid.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you exactly when they emerged, but all this was an evolving world at the time.
Yep.
So the packet radio group, though, you pretty much were your own community with these occasional interactions with the other people.
No.
No.
I would paint the picture that we were close to Collins and we were very close to BBN.
Yes.
Those were absolutely...
but within more the packet radio and the satellite and other things.
Oh, the
sort of
satellite,
came in.
yeah. And to some extent UCLA, but since we were the ones that had to make things, put it in radio, make them work, I think those were the three major ones, and there was a lot of interplay, and sometimes I think it would get a little testy, between the two.
Yes.
But healthy, it was okay, and I don't think there was any lack of respect at all among those participants. It was.
And no
I think it's
particular
fairly evident
issues.
from this exercise the camaraderie that exists between the major players in this program.
Yeah.
And so when you met at meetings, it was really an exciting and feeling of...
Everybody had their own responsibility, and I said before,
And often their own opinion.
and their own opinion, and we were the recipients of this stuff. So, guess what? I mean, if things weren't coming in or being delayed, I remember electronic mail was, 71 or so, and we'd gotten pretty used to it by that time, and there were times when we had to report progress, and why didn't we get to here? Why didn't we get to there? And then you get into these flaming sessions, about, I delivered that, you didn't test it right, those kind of things. And so at some point I would dig into those email things, particularly the Packet Radio weekly reports, and I'd say, look, you had this at this particular time, and this wouldn't necessarily agree with their versions of what was being said. So we had those points, but they were not unusual, and they were not in any kind of a lasting animosity or anything like that. It was just you were struggling to get something done against fairly demanding clients, in this case Bob and or Vint or both. But it was all in all, in retrospect, it was a wonderful camaraderie.
Any anecdotes you'd like to share? Funny stories? Or?
I just wanted to add a comment about the hardware support. Mike Sisko's group was just tremendous. I believe I had one spare set of packet radio for all the RF section and one for the digital section. But if I had a problem in the morning, I could call Mike Sisko. He would put one on a counter-to-counter at San Jose Airport, give me the flight number. In an hour's time from leaving SRI, when I had the flight number, I could come down here, park in front of the terminal in the waiting section, which you can't do these days, run in, grab the thing, and be back at SRI within an hour, and I'd have that thing playing at the end of the day. We had that kind of turnaround. It was just fantastic support from Mike.
Fantastic support from Collins
Yep.
for over a long period of time. Mike and Russ Whitaker, his technician, were with us every inch. Demos in Europe, demo everywhere.
They were like one company.
And Mike,
Essentially, we were all like the same company.
We all had a very common interest, and we wanted to make it play, and it did.
Yeah. One little anecdote, maybe we can close with. Vint tells this story a lot. I heard him in Palo Alto giving a talk, and I was in the audience, and here it rolls out again, and he tells it a lot more enriched than it actually was. But I was up at where 101 intersects now 280. There's a big, huge interchange, and I was out in the van alone making noise measurements, trying to collect noise, and there was lots of cars all over. So that was a good place, and I was sort of cheating and parking alongside of an exit ramp on the freeway, and a policeman came by and made me move, essentially. But here's how Vint tells it, and it's kind of, he loves the story. And so here, a bunch of guys are in the van, and a bunch of scientists in the back or something like this. And so up comes the policeman, and he sees this van, and there's not a mark on it, it's just completely naked. And so he's wondering what's going on. So he knocks on the back door, and one of the scientists comes to the door, opens it up, and says, "What's going on here?" And I says, "Well," the scientist says, "Well, we're making measurements for the government. We're trying to prove something." And the policeman says, "Which government?" and just regales at that story, and I'm the only one in the van, and there's nobody up there. I'm back trying to run an interdata computer and collect some data and so forth. And the truth of the story is that he made me move. He said this. I told him what I was doing, and he said, "Well, this isn't a very good place to do it," so I moved the van. But somehow it's gotten morphed into this really humorous thing. It's just like Bob Kahn tripes in the snows of Tamalpais. Every time he tells that, the snow gets deeper. And it's really kind of, it's one of the fun things, that you like to recall. But like most myths, they have a life of their own.
so he didn't ask you about.
Which
I don't
governments
honestly.
or-
I don't remember. If he could have inquired what government, and maybe that's true. I don't recall that happened, but
Would
why didn't it? It might as well have.
sure, but would often one of you be in the van alone? Is that?
Oh yeah, I was. Well, generally not when we did the packet radio
Right,
runs.
sure.
This was a channel characterization time, and I was the one doing that mainly.
Because obviously you'd have to go somewhere, stop.
Yeah, right.
And how were you in the van every day, or was this once a week? What was the?
More than once a week.
Yeah,
Either.
it was used a lot,
Yeah.
even
No
for
wonder
just
I couldn't
static
find it.
testing, because it was set up and everything was there, and so it was used a lot.